Well, it was our plan to go ride a train here in the near future.
It's always fun.
It's always fun, and this was going to be especially fun because it's the big boy. The big boy's going to be out and about this summer again, and they were going to take it to the Pacific Coast, to Portland, Oregon specifically, and have a meetup there with Locomotive 4449. And they're still going to do that, but the trip's been postponed because the tracks are quite busy because of supply chain issues and that sort of thing. Things have been on hold because of the pandemic, and finally the program is opening back up, and we were going to go for a ride, and we still are.
This is almost 3 years ago.
Yeah, almost exactly. And this was for the big May 10th, the 150th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike, the 150th anniversary of the Union Pacific.
Wow, I can't believe that's been 3 years ago.
And they had restored both of their big steam locomotives here, 4014 and 844, in anticipation of this great event. Both of these locomotives had been completely rebuilt, almost every moving part replaced.
What an amazing job.
Of course, it was all done in the shops in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where the Union Pacific has their heritage program, their steam program. And now the backstory and the big announcement that came down just a couple of days ago.
Yes.
This is the moving of Locomotive 4014. They moved it on my birthday.
Oh, they did?
They started the move anyway on my birthday in 2013.
Wow.
Long time ago. Seems a long time ago anyway.
Yeah, it seems like it.
But the locomotive was brought up from the Rail Giants Museum in Pomona, California.
Pomona.
A deal had been struck with the people there to swap 4014 for some other equipment, on the condition, of course, that 4014 was going to be brought back to operating condition and made part of the steam program with the Union Pacific.
Right, I look at that and I don't even know where they even began to start.
Can you imagine?
Oh, man.
Somebody just drives this into your driveway and says, could you restore this?
Here, let's fix it up.
Let's fix it up. But that's exactly what Ed and the steam crew did. And so the locomotive was taken to the Union Pacific shops in Cheyenne, Wyoming, but they did not start immediately rebuilding it.
Right.
They had to get 844 rebuilt first.
That's true.
So while they only had about 6 years to get this whole thing together, it wasn't to rebuild one locomotive, that was to completely rebuild 2 locomotives. And so 844 was up first, and we got to see it and chase it around a little bit once they got it running.
That was amazing.
It was
man.
Quite a day. But one of the questions that kept coming up was, why did they bring a big boy up from Pomona when they already had 3985 here in the Roundhouse?
That's a good question.
It's not a big boy, it's a Challenger class. It's almost the same engine, a little bit smaller, but not that you'd really notice.
I have a hard time telling them apart, to be honest.
And so the question has been for some time, why didn't they just rebuild 3985 instead of going out and looking for a different locomotive? And I think the assumption was that it was just because they wanted a big boy instead of having the Challenger restored. 3985 had been retired by the Union Pacific in 1962.
Whoa, yes, wow.
And it was put on public display, but then it was rebuilt to operating condition in 1981 by a volunteer group of Union Pacific employees who simply wanted to see it back out on the track.
That's cool.
So they basically just got the thing up and running.
There you go.
Fortunately, there really wasn't much wrong with it, and so it wasn't that Herculean of a task to get it up and running again. However, that history makes for a few problems with the locomotive, and those are the reasons why this locomotive wasn't rebuilt, and instead they went looking for a different engine. On a quick inspection of 3985, as it was never really deeply backshopped during all of those years that it was being run as part of the steam program, the problems just kept building up and building up. Giant steam engines, well, any steam engine, periodically needs major backshopping.
Right.
And that just hadn't happened with this engine, and there was a lot of rusted parts, and this was one of the most significant problems here, a warped flue sheet.
My.
That would require cutting all of this out and redoing it. There were also a lot of repairs that had been done over the year just to keep it running, and those would all need to be redone and properly put back to their original condition.
Boy, that looks like a lot of asbestos right there.
Yeah, I'm not sure what it is, but these locomotives originally were loaded with asbestos. But there's a lot of rust, a lot of just everything here needs to be taken completely apart and redone. And this was probably the biggest problem. There was a major leak between two of the boiler segments.
Oh my goodness, I would call that a leak for sure.
And that's not something you can fix easily.
No.
And so while this engine is completely rebuildable, not in the time frame that they had. So they went looking for a different engine simply.
I see.
And what better engine to pick than a big boy?
Oh, no kidding.
At first glance, it almost looks like the Challenger.
It does. I almost have a hard time to tell them apart.
This one's a little bit bigger, but they're very, very, very similar engines. But the cool thing about the big boy is this is a famous engine. This was the crown jewel of the Union Pacific in the 1940s.
Right.
And how amazing to get one of those operating again. And Ed Dickens and the crew here in Cheyenne set about to rebuild this. By the time they got 844 done, they only had 2 years left
Oh my.
to get this guy ready for May 10th. And we've been following the restoration right from the beginning.
Right.
And every once in a while, they would open the shops there in Cheyenne to the public for depot days. The shops aren't open anymore. I don't know if they will bring that back or what. But at any rate, at least one day a year and sometimes two, where the public had access to the shops.
Well, and to see the size of this thing, to be inside the firebox, it's like a room.
Yeah, and how many people can say they've been inside the firebox of a big boy?
Not many, but it was impressive.
It was really neat to see, and I've seen apartments that are smaller than this firebox.
I lived in a place that was smaller than that firebox, so I know.
And working at a breakneck pace, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, Ed and the crew were able to get this guy up and running. The test run was only days before it was supposed to leave for Utah.
Right.
And the driving of the Golden Spike. But they weren't cutting any corners. They were getting it right.
Right.
Right down to the literal nuts, bolts, and gaskets. Everything was getting redone. With one exception. They were rebuilding this big boy into an oil burner. It had originally run on coal, and rather than rebuild the tender, they simply used the tender from 3985.
Here we are, the Great Escape. We have to pull out buckets of rust, 5-gallon buckets of rust. Ready?
They had to pull hundreds of pounds of rust out of this tender, the 3985 tender.
I would hope there's a use for leftover rust.
You make a bunch of cassette tapes if
There
people
you
still
go.
use them. But they remanufactured thousands of parts, hundreds of stay bolts. It's like I was saying, every moving surface, almost every moving surface was replaced.
That's just wild.
And it was all done in time for the big event on May 10th.
I remember just holding my breath.
So a lot of the rumors that had been going around were that once this event was over, once the big boy was restored, then the steam program was going to tear into 3985 and actually rebuild. But instead, 3985 was simply dropped from the roster and nobody knew what was going to become of it.
Right.
And whatever was going on deep in the background, and frankly, none of us knew what was going to become of 3985. That is until just a few days ago. So it was just announced that 3985 is going to be completely rebuilt
Oh, really?
and brought back to operating condition. But one of the problems here is the Union Pacific needs a third locomotive like they need a third leg.
Oh, yeah, I guess.
So it's like the Union Pacific isn't all that keen on putting the money and energy into rebuilding this engine. So instead, they're turning it over to a volunteer group. They're known as Railroading Heritage of Midwest America.
Well, I think I'll just stick with the acronym.
It's easier, isn't
Yes,
it?
it sure. Well, even then.
They operate out of the old Rock Island Railroad shops and yard in Silvis, Illinois.
Oh, neat.
It's not open to the public. It's not a museum. They restore equipment to operating condition
Wow.
and then use it for excursions and that sort of thing.
Well, how fun.
And that is what the plan is for 3985.
Well, that's wonderful.
These guys are going to completely rebuild it and restore it and then start using it in excursion service, which is how they use all of this equipment here.
Right.
And if that weren't amazing enough, the news is even better than that. They're also going to give them 5511.
Oh.
Now, this locomotive has been here in the shops in Cheyenne for decades. There was some talk about restoring it to operating condition, but again, the Union Pacific doesn't need it, and they've really not had any interest in restoring it. Moreover, it has 5 drive axles.
Oh, my goodness.
And so it doesn't do curves. And it doesn't really do hills. It would run perfectly on the flatland east of Cheyenne.
Right.
But most of the excursions that they run are over a whole variety of tracks, and this locomotive would just be not appropriate for that.
I see.
And that's not all that's being given to the group in Silvis. They're also going to give them 6936.
I see.
A diesel locomotive, runs perfectly and is part of the heritage fleet, but it just isn't something that fits into their program. And they hardly ever fire it up. They might take it out just to make sure it's still running and then park it again. So it will actually get some proper use by the group there in Silvis. The 6900 class or Centennial locomotives were the largest diesel locomotives ever built. And to this day, they are the world's largest diesel locomotives.
Wow.
Back when it was announced that 4014 was going to be restored, there was a lot of talk around, well, when they finally rebuild 3985, maybe we'll get the opportunity to see 4014 and 3985 double-heading.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, we might actually see that now.
That would be great.
It sounded like something, one of those pipe dreams that was just never going to happen. We had no idea what was going to happen to 3985, but it certainly wasn't looking like it would ever run again.
But now there's a plan.
Now there's a plan, and it's going to run again. And it may even be back running on Union Pacific tracks.
You never know.
You just never know. Well, it is our hope to follow this move as they take these locomotives to Silvis, Illinois, and then we can visit Chicago.
Absolutely. Again, I don't mind Chicago at all.
I love Chicago, so this will be a great excuse to get out to that part of the world.
Right.
And maybe, just maybe, the group there will open up their shop. Again, it's not something they ever do.
Right.
It's not open to the public.
Nope.
But with this much interest in this locomotive, maybe, just as the Union Pacific used to periodically open their shops to the public, maybe, just maybe, they will open up those shops to let the public come in and see what's happening with 3985.
That would be nice.
And we will be there.
Yes, if that happens.
At any rate, if you're not a subscriber to the channel, you'll want to become a subscriber so you can follow along with the restoration of 3985.
That's right. Keep up with the trend.
Keep up with the trend. You could also like and share this video if you would like to, but the most important thing is to become a subscriber with the blue button right there. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring, and we will see you here on Tuesday.
Right.
Because we got something fun planned.
Oh, we sure do.